Over 13 incredible years, Alexander the Great and his Macedonians basically conquered the known world from Greece all the way to India. They started as this tight-knit brotherhood, forged in the heat of battle, but by the time it was all over, that bond, it was completely broken. So how did this happen? How did an army of comrades end up as subjects to a king who saw himself as a god?
All right, let's really get into it. We're going to trace this whole epic and honestly kind of tragic story through 5 key stages. We'll start with how they began, move through the conspiracies and cultural clashes, witness the explosive mutinies, and finally see how a totally new kind of army emerged from the ashes.
So let's rewind to the beginning, 336 BC. You've got this 20-year-old kid, Alexander, taking the throne, but his bond with the army, it had nothing to do with his crown. It was all built on a shared Macedonian identity, this idea that he was one of them, the first among equals, and a trust that was earned, not inherited.
I mean, this quote from the historian Plutarch, it tells you everything you need to know about young Alexander. He saw his own fate as being completely tied to his men. He wasn't some far-off king. He was right there in the mix, their most ambitious buddy, hungry for a glory he knew they had to win together.
And this right here, this is the foundation of it all. Years before he was even crowned, Alexander proved himself where it mattered most, to a Macedonian on the battlefield. He fought with them, he bled with them, he shared their dangers. That earned him a kind of loyalty that a royal decree could never buy. It was real.
But, well, that brotherhood wasn't built to last. As the campaign pushed deeper and deeper into Asia, the sheer pressure of holding absolute power started to turn toxic. The camp, once a place of camaraderie, began to fill with suspicion and fear. The king, who was a comrade, was slowly becoming an isolated and, a paranoid ruler.
And the Philototus affair. This was the first huge crack in the foundation. This wasn't just some trial, it was a real turning point. It signaled a massive shift from trust to paranoia, a moment where everyone realized that even the most powerful, most respected commanders were no longer safe from the king's suspicion.
As the historian Plutarch lays it out, this whole thing unfolded like a horrifying chain reaction. So, Philotas, a top commander, hears about a plot against Alexander but hesitates to report it. That hesitation gets twisted into complicity. Bam! He's arrested, tortured, and executed. And then, and this is the truly shocking part, Alexander, fearing revenge, sends assassins to murder Philotas's father, the legendary and totally loyal general Parmenion.
The historian Arrian just gives us the cold, hard political logic here. It's absolutely chilling. Parmenion wasn't killed because he was a traitor. He was killed because he was too powerful and too respected by the army to be left alive. It was a brutal political calculation that sent a crystal-clear message to every other Macedonian officer. Your loyalty is no longer enough to protect you. No one is safe.
Now, the physical distance from home was one thing, but a cultural distance was growing too. As Alexander conquered Persia, he started adopting their customs, and to his Macedonian veterans, this wasn't just him adapting, it felt like a deep and bitter betrayal of everything they stood for.
I mean, you can just see the two worlds colliding right here. For Macedonians, the king is the first among equals. For Persians, he's a living god. Macedonians valued blunt, sometimes brutally honest speech. Persians had this elaborate court ceremony. So when the vet saw Alexander wearing Persian robes, it wasn't a fashion statement. It felt like he was rejecting them, their values, their entire shared past.
And all that simmering resentment, it finally just exploded. During a drunken feast, Clitus the Black, the very man who had once saved Alexander's life in battle, he stands up and says what everyone's been thinking. He calls him out, challenging the king's new claims to be the son of a god.
And the king's reaction was just swift and brutal. In a blind, drunken rage, Alexander grabbed a spear and killed his friend on the spot. But here's the thing. Both Arrian and Plutarch tell us that the act immediately plunged him into this deep, agonizing remorse. It was a horrifying sign that the old comrade was still in there somewhere, just horrified by what the new monarch had done.
The whole debate over proskyneses, this Persian custom of bowing down flat on the floor before the king, that became the intellectual frontline in his culture war. The historian Callisthenes actually stood up to Alexander, arguing that it was an insult to Macedonian freedom. And he won the argument, but his defiance marked him. He was later tangled up in another plot, the conspiracy of the pages, and executed.
It proved that even when you were right, disagreeing with the king could get you killed.
So after years of non-stop marching, all this cultural tension, this simmering resentment, you can only push people so far. The army finally hit its breaking point. The very men who had conquered an empire now flat out refused to follow their king one step further.
The first mutiny wasn't a riot. It was actually quiet. At the Hyphasis River, deep in India, the men just stopped. They put their foot down. They were exhausted, homesick, and they'd had enough. For the very first time, Alexander's unstoppable ambition was defeated, not by an enemy, but by the silent, stubborn refusal of his own men.
But the second mutiny, back in Persia at a place called Opis, that one was an absolute explosion of rage. Alexander announces he's sending the old veterans home, and instead of seeing it as a reward, they see it as the ultimate rejection. They openly mock him, shouting, as Arrian tells us, that he should go on his next campaign with his new dad, the god Ammon. It was a massive insult.
Alexander's response, though, it was a complete masterstroke of psychological warfare. Arrian records his speech, and he doesn't use force. He uses shame. He reminds them of every single victory they won together, and then he flips the script and accuses them of deserting him among so-called barbarians. It was devastatingly effective.
The mutiny was crushed, and even though they staged this big reconciliation, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. The old relationship was gone, forever. In its place, Alexander made his new vision official, an imperial army, where his men were no longer his peers, but simply his subjects. Let's just pause and look at the before and after here, because the transformation over 13 years is just staggering. The army goes from a national Macedonian force to this multi-ethnic imperial machine. The leader goes from a first among equals to a divine absolute monarch. And that core relationship, it goes from a brotherhood of comrades to a simple dynamic of a king and his subjects.
This new reality was perfectly captured in this one unbelievable banquet at Opis. You have thousands of Macedonians and Persians sitting down together, drinking from the same cup. That close-knit, intimate bond of the Macedonian Brotherhood was gone, replaced by this grand public spectacle, a prayer for a new multicultural empire.
So, in the end, Alexander's journey turned him from a Macedonian king into an emperor of the world. But in the process of gaining that entire world, he completely shattered the unique brotherhood that made the whole thing possible in the first place. And that leaves us with this huge question that historians are still debating today. Was it worth the price?